My name is Sarah. I used to live with my two sons, but now they're both growing up and starting to live on their own. The first one to move out was my younger son, George. George asked a girl named Angela to marry him. They met at their job and had been dating for 3 years when George brought Angela home to meet us. Angela was really happy when she saw our big house. She works as an architect, so seeing a spacious home made her very excited. She also mentioned she's studying to become an interior decorator. I was curious about that, so I decided to study alongside her. At my age, it was a great pleasure to learn new things with someone else. A month after George introduced Angela, my older son Robert brought his girlfriend Karen to meet us. Karen looked noticeably younger than Robert. "Hi. We're planning to get married in 6 months, so get ready for lots of congratulations," she said right away. I tried to stay calm and listen, but she kept talking about money and asking about our house. I couldn't help but wonder if she was only interested in our wealth. Robert didn't say anything to stop her. Instead, he proudly declared, "We'll get married before George does." I sighed quietly, thinking about Robert's competitive nature. Robert and George are only a year apart in age, and I've always tried to treat them equally. But despite our efforts, there have always been people who seemed more interested in Robert, assuming he would inherit more because he's the older brother and our family has money. Surprisingly, some people would put down George by unfavorably comparing him to Robert. Hearing this repeatedly, Robert started believing he had to be better than George just because he was the older brother. As an adult, Robert became fixated on outshining George in everything: grades, number of girlfriends, even number of friends. While I admired his dedication to academics, both George and I were troubled by Robert's constant need to compete, even in areas where it didn't make sense. I'm sure George brought Angela home to one-up me with his fiancée. Robert must have rushed to introduce his girlfriend to gain an advantage over George. When I asked, "How long have you two been together?" Karen hesitated and said, about 3 months. We decided to get married in 3 months. I was surprised again by this sudden decision. It seemed too hasty. "Do you really need to compete with your brother?" After Karen left, I had a moment alone with Robert and gently said, "Robert, I see your competitive streak coming out again. Wanting to marry before George is one thing, but it doesn't really matter who marries first. And about deciding to marry after just 3 months, do you think that might be rushing things? Maybe you should consider living together first." I chose my words carefully to avoid upsetting him, but it seemed like he thought I was trying to ruin his plans to marry Karen quickly. "What's the deal? You always favored George," he said. "Dad and you never treated me like the older brother." By this, he probably meant we didn't give him special treatment just because he was older, like some other people might have done. We've always tried to treat both sons equally. I've never thought about who's more important. "And are you sure about marrying Karen?" She asked for big gifts and seemed overly interested in our house from the start. Honestly, Karen isn't the type my serious mother would usually like, but she's still the fiancé I've chosen. "Why did you accept George's fiancé so easily and not mine?" Robert complained. "It's because Angela was polite and respectful. Anyone would be wary of someone who doesn't show basic manners," I replied, thinking I was being reasonable. But Robert didn't agree and sighed in frustration. "You really do favor George," he blurted out. "But I'll get married before him," he added defiantly. As his mother, I felt partly responsible for not guiding him better, but I knew I couldn't change his mindset now that he was an adult. Once children grow up, parents aren't obligated to keep controlling their lives. They need to learn to stand on their own. Deciding to stay out of it, I let things happen naturally. Then one weekend while I was studying with Angela, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. To my surprise, it was Karen at the door. I hadn't been informed she was coming, but I invited her in nonetheless. Karen glanced at the study materials on the table and chuckled. "Are you two really studying at your age? Let me guess, did you both only finish middle school?" Her comment lacked politeness. "And Angela, you're not even married to George yet, right? So you're hanging around here, hoping for an allowance from your mother-in-law," Karen added, stunning Angela. Angela quickly shook her head, clearly taken aback. Knowing Angela well, I was sure she wasn't there for money. I placed a comforting hand on her shoulder and turned to Karen. "Please refrain from making unfounded remarks. Angela and I are studying together. She hasn't asked for, nor have I given her any money. In fact, I know she would refuse even if I offered," I said firmly. Angela nodded vigorously in agreement. She's genuinely polite and wouldn't visit to insult others or discuss money matters. I couldn't understand what Robert saw in Karen that made him consider marrying her. Karen seemed to pick up on my trust in Angela and abruptly finished her tea and cookies, then left quietly. But that wasn't the end of her unexpected visits. Whenever she knew I was with Angela, she would come over mockingly, commenting on how sad it was that we were studying. I began to wonder if Robert had encouraged her to belittle Angela, who was set to marry George. If so, her attempts to mock us only reflected poorly on herself. I couldn't quite grasp her true intentions. But I didn't want Angela to feel uncomfortable anymore. So we stopped studying at my place. Instead, we met at karaoke bars to study, sing, or just hang out at coffee shops. However, when Karen realized Angela wasn't coming over anymore, she remarked, "Finally, the troublesome daughter-in-law-to-be is gone. By the way, you should start thinking about leaving this house too, because once Robert and I get married, we'll be living here." Just when I thought she was satisfied, she made the most absurd statement. She told me to leave the house. Excuse me? This is news to me. I didn't know you and Robert planned to live here. You see, mother-in-law, you've been living comfortably in this house because you were loved by your husband and taken care of by your first son, Robert, right? But now you seem to favor your second son and his wife more than Robert. It's only natural for Robert to want you out and say he can't take care of you anymore. True, Robert stays here a lot, even though he has his own place. I guess he finds it easier with me handling things around the house. George, on the other hand, enjoys cooking for himself since moving in with Angela, because Robert is always here. She probably thinks Robert has taken over the house from my husband, and she called me a parasite because she thinks my husband's travels bring in lots of money, and I'm just living an easy life without working. Don't you get it, Mel? Your husband must have grown tired of you, which is why you suddenly want to study and get a job, right? Well, even if you try at your age, you won't achieve much anyway. I had had enough of Karen's presumptuous remarks. Trying to explain that I was studying for personal growth and not for work seemed pointless. Seeing me silent, she probably thought she had struck a nerve and said aggressively, "Don't interfere in our lives except for weddings and funerals." Honestly, at that moment, I realized I didn't want any relationship with Robert anymore. If he was serious about marrying this girl in the future, why should I tolerate a young woman who insults me and calls me names without knowing me at all? I didn't want to have anything to do with them, not even at weddings or funerals. "Well, let's end our relationship then," I said firmly. With that, I cut ties with both Robert and Karen. Robert was shocked and asked, "Why are you cutting ties?" I replied, "She said not to interfere. If you're curious, ask her yourself." Then, I blocked all their contact information. Even though my husband was overseas, I could still reach him if needed. I was tired of hearing Karen's name every day. To leave, I discussed the situation with my husband, and we decided to move. 6 months after cutting ties with Karen and Robert, my phone suddenly rang. I didn't recognize the number, but when I answered, it was Karen. "Hey Mel, why didn't you come to our wedding? It's strange for the groom's parents to be absent," she said. I was surprised and responded, "Excuse me? After we cut ties, why would I attend your wedding? We may have cut ties, but shouldn't you at least come to our wedding?" She insisted. She probably thinks more guests mean more gifts. But if none of the groom's family, not even his brother, were there, it would be awkward. "You did something, didn't you, Mel? You told everyone not to come to our wedding," she accused. "That's just absurd. Isn't the absurd part on your end? Did you choose your wedding date after seeing the invitation for George and Angela's wedding? Scheduling your wedding the day before your brother-in-law's is really unreasonable. Trying to overshadow your own brother is just wrong." "Shut up. Robert is the oldest, so he's the one who will inherit Dad's large fortune and the house. Everything revolves around Robert because he's superior," I sighed deeply. "Prioritizing Robert? My husband and I have never favored one son over the other. We've always treated Robert and George equally. If Robert feels differently, there's nothing we can do about it. And by the way, my husband doesn't have any vast inheritance. But I've heard Robert's dad travels a lot around the world and rarely returns to the States. Does that suggest he's a wealthy CEO or something? My husband is a photographer. He earns decently, but nowhere near what a big CEO makes. So if you married Robert thinking he's wealthy, you're mistaken. Though Robert does work for a reputable company, so financially you might be okay," I countered. Karen seemed taken aback, but quickly retorted, "Fine, Robert and I have a lovely home without you anyway. Oh, speaking of the house, I've put it up for sale and changed the locks. If you were planning to move in after your wedding, you might want to reconsider. You sold it. Since Robert isn't the owner, he can't live there, I stated firmly. Even if you give us the house now, we won't attend your wedding to discuss this. Your wedding is in New York City, right? Yes, that's correct. We're currently in Hawaii, so we won't make it. By the time we could arrive, your ceremony would be over. Actually, George and Angela's wedding was held in Hawaii. They've always dreamed of a Hawaiian wedding, so we flew in a day before. You'd think Robert and Karen would have known that since they received the invitation, I concluded, ending the call as Karen began to cry. I immediately blocked her number. It's unbelievable that they would reach out after we cut ties with them. While we were celebrating George's wedding, it seems Robert and Karen were having issues back home. Then 3 months after we returned, Karen showed up at my new place. Hey Mal, I heard you gave 5 houses to George's wife. Why didn't you give us anything? Well, you called me a parasite and wanted me out, remember? We've cut ties, so we're basically strangers. I don't give anything to strangers. It seems Karen finally realized that the main breadwinner wasn't my globe-trotting photographer husband, but me. She had foolishly cut ties with someone who has an income from properties worth $3 million, which I inherited or purchased. Now let's undo the disavowment. Let's live together again. No thanks. I have no intention of supporting strangers, I firmly stated. Besides, my uncle and aunt have offered to take you both in. I heard you quit your job, thinking Robert had money, and Robert resigned because of fallout from the wedding, right? Well, if both of you are jobless and have terminated your apartment lease, they've offered to help out since they need help on their farm in Nebraska. Wait, that truck outside must be your pickup. I already informed them you were here, I added, looking toward the front door. Someone was approaching, so I quickly opened it. Karen was behind me, shouting, "No, I don't want to go. I love city life." But without jobs, there's no way you can afford to live in an expensive city like New York, I reasoned. Eventually, with tears streaming down her face and her makeup ruined, Karen was taken away by my aunt and uncle. They were happy to have extra help, and both Robert and Karen found a place to stay. I felt I had made a good decision. The reason I gave Angela 5 houses was because I trust her to manage them well. It started as a trial, considering the possibility of us living together in the future and continuing to get along. Later on, Robert called the landline. "Mom, I'm thinking of divorcing Karen. She's not good at cooking and cleaning, but she insists that since she does household chores and works, I should respect her and give her more money. She even says hurtful things like marrying me was a favor to an older, less ambitious guy like me, and that I should support her." He pleaded for help. I've kept in touch with my aunt and uncle, so I'm aware of their situation. Last month, we found out Karen is pregnant, so divorce might not be approved. You're going to be the father. You need to step up, I told him before hanging up. Despite their issues, it seems Robert and Karen are staying together. I've decided to maintain my distance from them now. They need to take responsibility for their choices and work things out on their own.